Let's talk about state-tribe agreements. So we're going to talk a little bit about why we encourage states and tribes to have these agreements, have them in writing, some of the benefits including internal controls and program integrity benefits, as well as some considerations to make if you're a state coordinator or director with respect to tribes that are not directly funded by our agency. So as I mentioned this morning, any federally or state recognized tribe can apply directly to our agency for LIHEAP funding and to run their own LIHEAP. There are over 500 such tribes that would qualify, and currently we have a little over 150 that have applied and are directly funded. That number changes a little bit from year to year depending on if we get a plan from everybody and what their situation is that year. They have the same deadline to submit their plan, September 1 each year. And here is a map of the states where any state that has a shaded color is a state where we have directly funded tribes. States that don't have shading doesn't mean that there aren't tribes there. It just means those tribes are being serviced through the state LIHEAP rather than being run through their own tribe. There is a caveat in that we are aware of some states actually having their own sort of agreements or subgrant arrangements with tribes so that the money passes through the state and then the tribe runs the program according to the state rules. So there might be that situation as well. But the reason why we had this session here this afternoon with everybody together rather than through a separate breakout with just our tribal grantees is because everyone, states and tribes, have a role to play with tribal LIHEAP. And so we want to make sure we clarify what that is this afternoon. And that's ensuring that tribal members have access to LIHEAP services, that there's coordination on program integrity between the state and the LIHEAP programs such that we're preventing waste, fraud, and abuse, and that there's adequate outreach to the populations. So now I'm just going to briefly walk through 3 scenarios of questions or situations that we hear about pretty frequently in the field. And I'm just going to try to throw it out there in case anyone has some initial reactions. The first scenario is there's a Native American who lives on a tribal LIHEAP grantee reservation who applies for assistance at the state local agency. He says that the tribe sent him to the local agency because the tribe ran out of funds. How should the local agency assist this person? Does anyone have any initial reactions? Yes. The same as anyone else who walks in that office. Any other answers? Yes. They should check with the tribe. They should check with the tribe to see if they were funded by the tribe, assisted by the tribe? See if they were assisted or if the tribe really did run out of funds. To see if the tribe really ran out of funds. Okay, great. Susan? They said the tribe had their allotment and they had to have the beneficiation based upon that. They would not serve. The tribe would have to serve their. Okay, so in Alaska, they're saying they devise their allocation for the tribes in that state based on those needs, and if the tribe runs out of funds, they've used that allocation and they will not be further serviced by the state. Any other reactions? Okay, I'm not going to give you my reaction just yet. I'm going to walk through some principles and then we'll revisit this at the end of the session and talk about it a little further. Scenario 2, a tribe's LIHEAP coordinator is processing an application for a household. In this household, one adult is Native American and another adult is not. How should the coordinator take this information into consideration when processing the application? In the back. If they live within the boundaries of the service area, they should be assisted. Is that right? Okay, great. Susan, thank you. It would depend on if they were a community that said they were going to serve the whole community regardless, because in our state we split it up not necessarily upon ethnicity, but maybe a tribe to serve a whole community. If it was a community that was served by the tribe and the state, it would depend on who had applied as head of household. So if the Native individual had applied as the head of household, the application would go to the tribal organization. If the non-Native person had applied as head of household, Okay, that's very interesting. So it sounds like the state of Alaska has agreements with their tribes, and they're very specific to different types of household status mixes and who will serve who in different situations, depending on who the head of household is and their background. Any other? Yes.
Our tribe would consider the fact that the person applying should be the Native American or the household.
Okay, so in this case, the head of household is the applicant, and that should be a Native American. Okay, great. Yes.
We would serve them, the native, if it's a native household.
Okay.
But we also will check with DHS to make sure they weren't already served by them.
Okay, so because there is one Native American in the household, you'll serve everybody. Okay. But you'll still check with the state to see if they were serviced there. Okay, great. Any other reactions? Okay, good. Good comments. Scenario 3, my last scenario. A woman has just been appointed as the new LIHEAP director at the state. On her second day of work, she gets a request from the governor's office asking how the state provides services to its Native American population. What steps should she take to respond to this request? Anybody? Someone said state plan. Should be laid out in their state plan how they serve Native Americans. Check the contracts with the tribal organizations. Good.
Check the ACF if they make resolutions. So our regional rep should be able to tell you whether or not who would serve, and that's the big one.
Great. So check with our office to see what documentation we have about the state and tribe and what should be happening there. Heather. And Susan from Alaska is a peer mentor on state tribe agreements and resolutions. Very good for all of you to know. A good resource for you here. She's also part of our performance measures work group. So for states who have questions about that, you can just talk to Susan all day long. Any other thoughts? Okay, good. Really good responses. Thank you very much for that participation. So let's just walk through some concepts, and then, as I said, we'll come back to those at the end. Why have an agreement between the tribe and the state? Is it required by us? Absolutely not. Nowhere in the federal statute or regulations does it say you must have an agreement or that it must be in writing. Should you have one? We strongly encourage you to consider having one and that it be in writing. Why? Because we think there are benefits to both the tribe and the state, and we'll walk through those now. Advantages. These are just a few that popped to mind. So, for those of you who've been to our prior trainings, you know we had a session at our regional trainings last year where we talked about the latest data that we got from the Census Bureau on income-eligible households, on reservations and adjacent trust lands and that. And so if there is no agreement between the tribe and the state, our statute requires us to factor into our formula when we distribute the funding to all the grantees based on the best data that we have available, which is through the census, on the proportion of income-eligible Native Americans on a reservation compared to the income-eligible population for the rest of that state. And so that's why when I say whether a tribe is directly funded by us will impact a state's funding for the year is because the way Congress devised our funding formula is that we kind of look at those two populations, the low-income populations for the tribe and the state, and we look at that ratio, and then we set aside a portion of money from the state for that tribe to serve those income-eligible households. If a tribe decides not to apply to us directly, that portion of money stays with the state, but the expectation is that the state will then service that tribe and those income-eligible household members. Does that mean that every household that is eligible will receive assistance? Not necessarily. As you know, each of you have broad discretion in how you set your eligibility rules and your benefit matrix, and that's going to impact the percentage of households that you actually serve. We have noticed kind of a pattern that tribes work really hard to set their benefits at a level so that as many of their income eligible households get served as possible. And we've noticed that states really can't find that feasible to serve their entire income eligible population. So they might set their benefits a little higher but serve a smaller population. As you might be aware, nationally the program only reaches about 20% of the income eligible population. So all of that kind of goes into play with the funding. But if there's an agreement between the tribe and the state, those two parties can say, look, we're not going to rely on that base amount that HHS can provide. We're going to negotiate something else that we think is a more fair representation of the need for that tribe. Because we recognize that the data we have may not be the best estimate. It's just all that we have and that we can use consistently across the country. But a state may be open to looking at other data that the tribe can provide. It might be additional sources regarding the income eligible population. It might be the availability of certain fuel vendors and fuel prices on the reservation. It could be a whole host of different data that's really between the two parties to figure out what you want to consider and negotiate. And so we will not get involved in that decision making for you. We cannot make a decision as to what agreement is fair between the two of you. We're happy to facilitate a telephone conversation between the parties if you would like that, just to help keep communication open. But again, the negotiation has to be between the tribe and the state, and we won't weigh in one way or the other about whether it's fair. The only thing we'll let you know is this is what you would get without the agreement. So it can't be any less than that. That's the floor. Other advantages to having agreements. So aside from the funding amount, there are a lot of different areas that the agreement can touch. You can have certain controls and coordination procedures in place to ensure that there's communication between the state and the tribe or the local agencies and the tribe to make sure that the same household isn't being served by both. That there's data sharing. We've seen a few examples of some tribes that have been able to get some access to state systems to verify data and share intake systems. Decisions can be made about what we were just talking about with that scenario about, okay, what population will the tribe serve versus the state? So if there's no agreement, our expectation is that the tribe will serve every Native American, income eligible Native American household on the reservation, regardless of affiliation with the tribe. So perhaps your agreement may want to vary that a bit, and you can negotiate that with the state if you want to have a more narrow definition or policy. Again, you can, so some tribes don't necessarily have a defined reservation area, and so they, you know, the same block, you might have a mix of tribal households and non-tribal households, and so being clear about what the geographic boundaries will be between the state and the tribe, who's servicing who, can be helpful. Including information about referrals and services between the state and tribal programs, just a few examples of things you can lay out in the agreement. So I think I covered the the allocation. This is just a graphic showing the comparison between income eligible households divided by the income eligible households for the rest of the state, and that's how we get a percentage to multiply against the amount of funding for the state. Again, the data is from the Census Bureau's American Community Survey, and we look at several years' worth, averaging the data, going back to the most recent year that they have available for us. So I mentioned that absent an agreement, our census data is the floor. That's the minimum amount of funding that the tribe would get. So if there's a state-tribe agreement and there's a clause in there about an allocation that's different than that, our assumption is that that amount would be higher than that floor. So we've seen a wide variety of approaches to the allocation in agreements. It can be a fixed dollar amount. We have some tribes that get a flat $4,000 every year, regardless of how much funding we get from Congress each year. We have some tribes that get a percentage. So every year it's maybe 1% of the state allocation. And the difference there is that when the state's funding amount changes from year to year, then so will the tribes change along with it based on that percentage. Or it could be an agreed upon household number of income eligible households for that tribe. And so again, our number is from the census, and the state and tribe might agree, well, okay, maybe that's not as accurate a reflection of the actual number of households for that tribe, so we'll agree that it's 50 households higher or what have you based on whatever data they've looked at. And then we will take that household count into consideration when calculating the percentages. So I think I covered some of those issues earlier about the different data that and considerations you might be talking about when negotiating an agreement. The duration of the agreement, it can be an annual agreement. It can be for a fixed number of years, whether it's 3 years, 5 years, or it could be an agreement that's basically standing until rescinded, remains in effect until rescinded. The one con to that last approach is that it just can be easy for everyone to kind of forget that we haven't talked about our agreement in a while. And so the data that was used to support that negotiation may become a little stale after a while. So if you do have an agreement that didn't have a prescribed expiration period, you might just want to take a look at that and maybe revisit whether you should have another conversation based on more current data and information. Because again, all of our goals collectively is to make sure we're able to serve people as well as possible. And of course, you can extend an agreement based on the agreement of both parties before it expires. So we talked a little bit about how you can define which types of households will be serviced by the tribe versus the state. Is it going to be every household that resides on the reservation? Is it going to be just households where the head of household is a Native American or an enrolled member of that particular tribe, or a tribal member who's not necessarily enrolled? Is it going to be, what happens if you have a household with different members who some are Native American, some are not? So again, we're not going to weigh in and say which way you should go with that, but we're going to leave that up to you to decide and spell that out in your agreement so that both the tribe and the state are clear about who's servicing who. And most importantly for your intake workers to know when they're processing applications. Again, we talked about the service territory. So again, this is most, sometimes you get questions where, oh, I'm a tribal member of this reservation, but I'm actually living 200 miles off the reservation. So should I be served by the tribe or the state? I'm really closer to the state's local agency. So having those kinds of situations spelled out in the agreement can be helpful. And we talked about the situation where some tribes don't actually have a defined boundary, and so how are you going to make it clear to the tribe and the local agencies which households are being serviced by who? Preventing duplicate benefits. So, you know, we ideally don't want the same household getting double benefits, right? We don't want them being serviced by the state and the tribe. What makes them special that they get that extra benefit? So having procedures in place where the local administrating agencies for the state and the tribal intake offices can communicate and share information so that they can avoid a household actually applying to both and getting double benefits is really helpful. We had heard that some tribes, like the Lumbee Nation, had had some success in actually getting some access to the state's intake system. I encourage you, I saw Patrick Strickland earlier from Lumbee. You might want to talk to him. And I know there have been some recent changes to that, but we really do encourage states and tribes to talk about that opportunity because, again, it's the population within the state, it's all impacting the state's allocation, so it's in everyone's best interest that you have good data sharing and program integrity controls for both parties to make accurate eligibility and benefit determinations. And if you don't have a system, we know some tribes may not have enough administrative dollars to invest in a system. If you're mostly working off of pen and paper or maybe Excel, just having, knowing who to call at each agency or a fax number where you can share lists as people are applying can be helpful. Just, again, having those lines of communication open between the various offices. So, again, we encourage the agreement to be in writing. And why is that? Because, as we all know, people move on. People in our office change, people in your offices change, and so if it's just a verbal agreement, it's very hard for the next people who come up to really ascertain what was agreed upon. So to have it in writing for your offices to both have a copy, for our office to have a copy, you can submit it in OLDC with your plan so that we know how to base your allocation and answer any questions that we get from your offices is very helpful. Ideally, the agreement should be signed by both parties, tribe and state. And again, send us a copy. So these slides I think we've covered, but there's just when you are referring back to these when you're back in your office, it's some questions that help you walk through some considerations that you might want to spell out specifically in your agreement in terms of what roles the state and the tribe will play when servicing Native American households. And again, I mentioned that if there's no agreement, our assumption is that all Native American households within the tribe's area will be serviced by the tribe because that's what we're basing our data off of and your funding allocation off of. But that's not what you're limited to in your agreement. Preventing duplicate payments. So we talked a little bit about this. And so again, we mentioned roughly 20% of the income eligible population nationwide is served. In some states, it's much less. It may be as low as 4% or less. And so we want to make sure that we can stretch these limited dollars as much as possible and serve as many households as we can with at least somewhat of a meaningful benefit that it actually helps reduce their home energy burden, the amount of money that's going towards their heating and cooling bills. So again, this illustration is trying to highlight that it's possible that a household may first go to apply to the state, get assistance, and then later in the year go and apply to the tribal office. And so how do these two parties know that this household has already received a benefit unless they're communicating and have systems to talk to each other? So I think I've covered this. Let's move on to outreach and intake. Yes, sorry, there are questions. Okay.
And it's been my vendor who brought it to my attention and said, hey, this person got a benefit from both of you. So there's some value also to having that good relationship with your vendor and making them aware of what your rules are.
I think that's an excellent point that Susan raises about not only is important for all of us to work well together and share information, but for us to really develop those good working relations with the utilities and the energy vendors, the deliverable fuel vendors, and making sure that they feel comfortable that they can flag for the state and the tribe, hey, this household has already been serviced, and make you aware of that. Thanks for that point. Kathy, I think you had a point. Yes.
For instance,
Okay.
In Maine, we do not only have
Mm-hmm.
And there have been occasions that we've gotten a call, about providing assistance to a tribal member that served under the tribal livelihood program about eligibility for a furnace replacement, for instance. And I just, maybe you can, in our agreement, we have agreements in place, but they don't specifically talk about weatherization.
Okay.
The intent is that, the agreed upon percentages for the tribes is based on fuel assistance.
Sure. Right.
And that we would not provide those services for checker weatherization because they may have different eligibility criteria.
Right. So great point from Kathy from Maine about weatherization. I'm sorry I didn't have that on the slide. How to unpack weatherization. So you know that aside from the weatherization assistance that's funded through LIHEAP, potentially it's optional to you, the U.S. Department of Energy has a weatherization assistance program, WAP, which is funded to all of the states and the District of Columbia. To my knowledge, there are only 3 directly funded tribes through DOE, Navajo Nation, and I always forget about the other 2. So in those cases, they would have a different situation, but
Tribal set-asides under the DOE grant where we have a prescriptive amount set aside to weatherize homes.
for the tribes. Okay, so Kathy is mentioning that, for example, in her state, none of her tribes are a direct DOE WAP grantee. So for part of her grant from Department of Energy, there are specific amounts that are set aside for her to service the Native American household with the DOE weatherization. So that's DOE's weatherization. So for LIHEAP weatherization, again, you can use up to 15% of your total LIHEAP funding for weatherization assistance, and that's pretty broadly defined, up to each of you to define what you consider to be weatherization assistance. It does have to be low cost and residential. Those are the only 2 things really prescribed in our rules. The assumption is that you're applying the same rules to your weatherization as you are to your regular bill payment assistance for LIHEAP. If you choose to do it differently, that's fine, that's up to you, but that should just be spelled out in your agreement with the respective tribes. Where this can become complicated is that many states many state LIHEAP offices don't administer the weatherization funding from LIHEAP. What they will usually do is transfer that money to a different state agency that gets the DOE WAP money, and then they'll coordinate those 2 pools of money to run weatherization. So if that's the situation, again, we're assuming that the state is following those DOE rules and that those Native American households are getting weatherization assistance through that mechanism. On the tribal end, if they're a directly funded LIHEAP grantee, again, they have the same choice as the states do in terms of, okay, of how much money I got from LIHEAP, do I want to allocate any towards my own weatherization assistance, aside from whatever we can try to get through the state from DOE. I will say that not every tribe chooses to run weatherization. This is really just my very limited impression, but I would say almost all, I think all but maybe 6 or so states use some LIHEAP funding for weatherization, whereas I would say many tribes do not use LIHEAP money for weatherization. And even if tribes are using money for and please, for the Native American grantees that are here, if I'm misspeaking, please correct me. But for those tribal LIHEAP that are setting aside money for weatherization through LIHEAP, can be a very different type of assistance than you would it's normally not as extensive a weatherization program as you would get through WAP. And part of that might be because of logistical issues. Like when we visited some of the tribes up in Alaska, they have such issues just trying to get the materials and get qualified service people out there to actually do the work that oftentimes the tribes might have to just provide equipment, and or it might be and they have to self-install, for example. So very different programs compared to the state usually. Did that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions at this point? Okay. So now let's talk a little more broadly about if a tribe hasn't applied to our office to be directly funded from LIHEAP, what is the role of the state LIHEAP director where that tribe is located? Well, again, you're still going to be servicing that tribe's income-eligible households in accordance to your normal state rules on benefits and eligibility. But it's really important to make sure you're aware of that. We have run into the situation where new directors have come on board and they weren't informed that, and they didn't realize they had certain tribes that they needed to make sure they got serviced. So please be aware of who's being directly funded by us versus who's not being directly funded by us in your state. Please make sure that regardless of whether you're a state that's centrally running your program or if you're using your local grantees, that everyone's aware of conducting adequate outreach to those tribes and tribal members so that they're aware of the state LIHEAP and how they can apply. Again, with the federal statute, there's the emphasis to target benefits to the highest burden households, as well as to target vulnerable members like elderly, young children, and disabled members. So making sure that your outreach actually reaches those hard to reach households. And so also you see here under these 4 bullets here, not only making sure that they're aware of the state program, that they're aware of how to get the application, making sure they have the ability to get assistance in completing the application and getting it to the state office or local agency, but particularly the 4th bullet on geographic accessibility. Just as a state needs to ensure there's geographic accessibility for non-tribal households that are located in rural areas or otherwise homebound, you need to make sure that your non-directly funded tribal tribes are being reached by your subgrantees and your team at the state. And so oftentimes they're going to be located in those rural areas and have their own homebound population. So you really want to make sure that your locals are able to get out there and make sure that those applications are coming in. And so there's monitoring that the state can be doing to be seeing, okay, are we reaching the right number of Native American households from these tribes, or are we really not seeing many applications? Why is that? Are we doing adequate outreach and application assistance? And then the last point, just be aware of certain tribal events and needs during the year, that if you're doing your outreach plan for the year, you want to be mindful of times where Native Americans might be out doing subsistence harvesting and will be not reachable for a few weeks at a time potentially, or they might be having significant cultural events, powwows and other events, and not be reachable. And so you don't want to do your outreach and your application assistance when most of those households won't be available to receive it. So including that in your planning each year, making sure you get public comment on that. And while we're talking about public comment on your plan, making sure that you're getting public participation from those tribes on your plan that from where they're not directly funded by us. So I think I've talked now about the rural communities. Again, you can do outreach at some central places like post offices, senior centers, places of worship, anywhere you might be reaching a good number of our target population. Also consider, again, with the remote location of some of these tribes, they may have very limited internet access. And so you'll need to think of the different ways that you can receive applications. If you're a state that doesn't normally allow mailed-in applications, but you have a tribe that cannot really reach your local office and they're not directly funded by us, how are you going to accept applications from people in that area, and making considerations so that we aren't what's the word I'm looking for? That we're not missing out on people applying for the program because they literally just cannot get the application and send it to you. So I think I've talked quite a bit about this topic. And again, the homebound individuals apply both states and tribes. So let's go back to those scenarios. So we had some really good comments, and I think probably the takeaway message that hopefully all of you have at this point is that there really isn't one right answer to any of these scenarios, that the discretion is really in all of your hands. And so in this scenario where we had a Native American who lived on the reservation but applied at the local agency, we'd be wanting to make sure that whether you have an agreement, does your agreement spell out the responsibilities between the state and the tribe, and then provide that information forward. If there isn't an agreement, then the Native American would be referred to the tribe. For scenario 2, the tribe's LIHEAP coordinator is processing his application where there is one Native American and one who's not. Again, this comes back to, is there an agreement? Does it address this issue? And if not, because there's a Native American in the household, we'd be assuming that the tribe would be servicing that household. For scenario 3, where you have a new state director and she's asked, how are we providing services to the Native American population? As people mentioned, you look at your state plan, making sure you have an adequate outreach plan, and that you are making sure that you're tracking your funding to make sure that adequate funds are going to servicing those tribes that are not being directly serviced or funded by our agency. So with that, are there any other questions before we move on to the next session? Yes?
Is it possible to find out what our award would be without a tri-state agreement?
So the question is, can someone find out what their award from HHS would be in the absence of an agreement with the state? We can tell you what the household count would be for your tribe, or what that percentage would work out to out of your state allocation. We really wouldn't be able to estimate the exact dollar amount, because usually when you're trying to do these negotiations, it's in preparation for the coming federal fiscal year, so we don't know what our funding is yet from Congress. But if we provide you the percentage or the household count, you can certainly look at the number the state got this year as an example and try to get a sense from there. But until we get our final budget from Congress, it's anyone's guess as to whether we'll get more or the same or less funding compared to last year.
You can tell them what it would have been last year.
Yeah, right. We can tell you what it would have been the prior year, if that's helpful to you.
And you said it can't be, your agreement with the state can't be less than what?
That's correct. So any agreement negotiated between the tribe and the state would be for either the same as our allocation or more. There's still a benefit to having an agreement even if it doesn't impact the allocation because of all these other reasons we talked about, but it should not diminish the amount of the allocation to the tribe. Other questions or comments? It's good questions. Okay, great.